Okay, so I'm really excited today because we've got Nigel Lockett who's come to talk to us. Nigel has been Professor of Entrepreneurship and Head of the Hunter Centre for Entrepreneurship at the University of Strathclyde. He was awarded a prestigious National Teaching Fellowship for outstanding contribution to enterprise in higher education. He's a fellow and past president of the Institute for Small Business and Entrepreneurship. And you may also know him because he has been blogging for a while, and I think he's going to be telling us a little bit about that, as the Dyslexic Professor. So we're really lucky to have Nigel come down from Strathclyde to talk to us today. He's going to be telling us about Dyslexia Superpower, moving from disability through learning difference to advantage. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Penny, for that introduction. I'll sort of wander around for the next hour or so. I'm going to divide the session into three parts. So I've just got about 10 minutes of some slides I want to share with you, sort of my journey to disclosure, to the point where I decided to tell everyone I was dyslexic, perhaps about 2 years ago. And then a little bit more of a talk around some of the things that emerged for me as I started to blog once a week about being a dyslexic academic. And then there'll be time for a sort of a Q&A session. So that's my plan. I should just say I did check out University of York, and I noticed that Lord Sainsbury is also talking on campus. So I should just check. Is anyone here to see Lord Sainsbury? You're in the wrong place. Yeah? And the reason why perhaps that makes me smile a little bit more is that my grandmother name, she's no longer with us, was Florence Sainsbury, and she used to tell us all when we were little that she was related to the Sainsburys of the Sainsbury's supermarket. I've never been able to track that down on ascendry.com, but anyway, maybe we're connected. So that's what I really would like to do today, as Penny said, is just talk a little bit about why I think maybe this is the moment to start thinking about dyslexia not as a disability, not even as a learning difference, but maybe as an advantage. And I jokingly say that it's a superpower. And I'll explain why I do that as a joke, tongue-in-cheek, but in fact there's something quite serious about that message. So that's what we're going to be doing. Just really 3 slides from me to get us going. Really talking about how I moved from being that, however old I am on the left there, maybe I'm 5 or 6, through to going to school, and then this is me now coming out in December 2017 as the dyslexic professor. And I came out just to myself, and I put out my first blog and said, I'm now going to do this on my LinkedIn profile and on my website, thinking maybe no one would notice. People noticed. Hence I'm here, but hence I've done 1 or 2 public talks about it. So that's the journey. So maybe we should talk a little about life before school, the good old days. So this is me before I went to school. I was having fun, I think, in that shot. I don't know where I was. I would say as a young child before going to school, I think I was quite creative. There was lots of things going on in my mind and my world around me. I was constantly exploring. I remember my parents saying that when I was little, they used to look for where I was because I would be off doing something, exploring wherever it might be. So I was creative as I was exploring. I think I was quite gregarious. I was making friends amongst my peers, in a sense, really beginning to sort of emerge as a child, and I would say, looking back, with hindsight, I would be a happy child, and I could be characterised as that. And of course, when I say preschool, I think I'm also sort of saying pre-words, as in the written word. So this is me at that point, and then something quite dramatic happened for me. I went to school. For any of you in the audience who are dyslexic, you will have your own individual story of what school was like for you. This is what happened to me. I think it was exacerbated. This is me. I'm probably 7, about to turn 8, and I was going to boarding school, which is just a consequence of life at that time. And prior to that, I'd moved through a lot of primary schools. So nobody had spotted anything unusual about me, probably because I was always moving. But this was when I was settling down in one school. And what happened to me during that time, I was constantly afraid at school, because I was afraid that someone was going to ask me to do something with words, either write them, read them, learn them. Something was going to happen. And so I was constantly afraid. Very early on, I started to fail. So failure became inbuilt to my school experience. You name it, I could fail it, particularly if it had words in it. And maybe sometimes even if it required a coordination, could be a challenge for me. And one of the things that I did, and everyone will develop their own coping strategy, is I started to use humour. So I developed a very astute sense of humour. I could normally spot the joke before anyone else, and I could deliver that one-liner that just deflected totally away from the fact that I was effectively illiterate, and I could move the conversation onto something else. So humour became one of my main means of defence or deflection. I would say also that being at school, and you have to go to school for a long time, this is at least 10 years, and for me it was even longer, I would say that it made me quite sad. So it's not a good experience being at school, realising your peers are succeeding and you're not, being labelled as stupid, lazy, thick, and not surprisingly, when you don't have an explanation, you believe what people are telling you. So I emerged from that formal education system, I would say, a little bit sad about what happened to me. So I think it's useful now to just say, that's really interesting. What did that mean for me? What that really meant is that I would say now as an adult, I can recognise some of the attributes that I have that serve me well, that have come out of the consequence of that experience. So being afraid means that I had to constantly scan my environment for anything that was potentially hostile. So I was looking out for the danger. Is someone going to ask me to read? Am I going to have to do something that involves words? What's the teacher going to do next? All the time I'm scanning the environment for danger. So that's my default. I go into any new situation and I'm looking around, I'm scanning, I'm alert, because something awful might happen. Well, something awful did happen regularly, so I got used to that. I think the failure for me meant that I learned to fail. I'm here. I'm here. So I failed and I succeeded. So I learned to deal with failure constantly, which meant that I'm not saying that I would want to continuously fail, but a consequence of failing is that you do learn to pick yourself up and get back on and do those things. So for me, I would say that resilience has been something that emerged through that constant failure. I think I said really to develop humour, to deflect in this way meant I had to be really quite quick thinking. I had to spot the joke. I had to spot the opportunity to deflect, and I became effectively fine-tuned in that approach. And one of the advantages of being sad, and I'm not advocating sadness as a default, is that you begin to, I felt anyway, you begin to appreciate other people's sadness, because you've experienced sadness from the age of whatever it is continuously, and therefore you develop a more astute, empathic way of thinking. So normally, and I don't do this all the time, but I'd say normally in most situations I can very quickly understand and feel what it's like for someone else. In a sense, I can put myself in someone else's shoes. And I'm an academic now, but I started my professional life, my working life, as an entrepreneur. So I'm an entrepreneur turned academic. And actually being an entrepreneur, it's very useful to put yourself in your customers' shoes because you understand what it's like for them. So I would say that, yes, there are some challenges about being dyslexic at school, but I would also say that my response to that, and what I recognise now as an adult as positive parts of who I am, I would say I can think back and link them to those experiences. So, December 2017, I decided, really, I think because I'd sort of had enough of keeping it a secret, I'd never really disclosed it. Only people very close to me would realise I was dyslexic. I had succeeded by measures in our society, in our literate society. I'd got a professor, I'd been a professor for a number of years in a Russell Group university. I'd reached my pinnacle. I thought, well, actually, no one's going to fire me if I say I'm dyslexic. And so far, I've kept a job. So I just thought maybe this was the moment to do it, not knowing what the consequence of that decision would be. So I started to blog, and what I would say, and I'm going to talk about that experience, what I learned doing that, is that I think it's made me really quite determined now. I feel that having come out now, I'm quite happy to do, happy, maybe not the right word, I'm prepared to do public talks about being dyslexic. I feel that I'm really happy to share this experience. I do feel liberated. It wasn't very nice not telling anyone that I'd got dyslexia, making mistakes, maybe sometimes those being pointed out to me. So actually, I'm very relaxed about the fact I say I'm dyslexic. And I was just saying to Penny over coffee and Mo that my last job interview, I actually said at my job interview, oh, and of course I am dyslexic and I'm blogging as the dyslexic professor. And they still gave me the job. So far, so good. I think what I really do appreciate now is that I loosely call this picture thinking, but we may use some other words later on this evening. I think I'm a picture thinker, and I see that as a really powerful way of thinking. And this is my argument around moving from the notion of disability to difference to advantage. So we're going to explore that a little bit more. And I do feel like I'm a survivor in the sense that I've got here, I've reached, in a sense, I don't want to be promoted beyond the job I'm in now. I'm very happy doing what I do. So I feel that I've survived to this point. So let's now, if you're happy, to just move on to perhaps a slightly different phase of the evening. I'm going to just blank out the slide so that we can have a little bit more of a sort of a conversation. So what I thought I'd do is, I said that I was blogging for 52 weeks of the year with no idea who was going to read these blogs. What's really interesting about that is that I was asked about 6 months ago if I'd write a chapter for a book which is being published next year, which is called Entrepreneurship, Dyslexia and Education, Research, Principles and Practice. And I'm writing a chapter called The Year in the Life of the Dyslexic Professor, because I converted the 30,000 words of my blogs into a, whatever it was, 5,000 word book chapter. So what I've done is I've just picked out some of the things that emerged for me during that time, and particularly based on my personal challenges, but also how I now see the organisational advantages that I bring to my employer and bring to the things that I do. And that's why I'm really saying that I think it's time for us to move beyond the disability label. I'm prepared to meet you at Learning Difference, but I'd really like to encourage you to think about this as an advantage. And I really say that in the spirit of my life's experiences. More diverse organisations, more diverse groups make better decisions and achieve better outcomes. So for me, this isn't a discussion about disability. This is a discussion about diversity and the power of diversity. So that's where I'm coming from. And I do recognise there's a law and there's not the Disability Act, thank you, the Equality Act, and I recognise the value of that. But I'm actually saying I would like to move a little bit beyond that. So if you're happy to go on that journey with me, we'll do that. What I would say is that anybody knowing me at 8 would have thought, no way is that boy going to end up in a university as a professor leading what's probably UK's top academic department for entrepreneurship with the ambition to be Europe's. That's the ambition. So nobody would have really have thought that I would have achieved that. I underachieved in every academic environment I've been in, and I've often been ridiculed in those environments. And I won't bore you with the trauma. If you're dyslexic, you have been in the trauma of being in a room where people are reading out and you can see your sentence coming and you're trying to find the sentence in the book, and when you stand up, you get your first word wrong and people laugh. Now, that only happens a few times and you just realise that humiliation is part of your school experience. And I can, if I want to, I can go back and just imagine that feeling. Even today, there are things that I just won't do. Yep, I will not read out loud. So I've got my notes here, but it's in big letters, it's all scribbled over, and it's just me, a visual thing. I wouldn't read out loud, and yet in my field, I'm seen as a top professor. And I don't say that in a sort of like, wow. I'm just saying, isn't it interesting that in my field of entrepreneurship and my student feedback is really good, all of the things that I do professionally, I get high levels of recognition for, and yet actually I was a failure at school. And actually going through that has taught me a lot. So my journey to being a top professor in top universities, so Lancaster, Leeds, Strathclyde, these are really good universities. You need to get a PhD and they're written, so I was able to get through those barriers, but certainly I could never imagine that 8-year-old or many people around me achieving that. So I'm saying to you this evening that I think we need to think about dyslexia as a superpower. What I notice about dyslexic people, I'm very lucky now, I get to meet a lot of academics, a lot of adults with dyslexia. What they can do, I noticed, is they can deal with complexity. And they can deal with complexity where things are changing really quickly. There are some things they can do which are outstanding. They can see patterns in relationships, in data, in systems that other people can't see as quickly. They can do things like look at objects, look at plans, imagine the building from the plan. They can look at maps, they can recall a walk, relate it to a map and draw the mountains. So what I notice with dyslexia is they can deal with very complex situations, they can crystallize information really quickly, they can often explain it succinctly, and they can operate in this really very complex dynamic environment. And I think what's also interesting, and this may be a consequence of our educational system, is I do think they can combine that with empathy and calmness. So one of the things you have to do as a school pupil with dyslexia is that you have got to experience that sadness, that's fine, but also you've got to keep calm. You can't give away the fact that you are struggling. So I meet many successful academics and professionals who have been dyslexic, and will talk about their time at school in that way. So, having said all of that, why wouldn't organisations want to target dyslexic people to recruit them? Yeah? We're going to come back to that. So, I wonder if there's a dyslexic glass ceiling. So we're all familiar with the idea of glass ceilings to do with ethnic minorities, with women in senior management, but what if there's a word ceiling? Perhaps in our organisations, in our government, in our industry, in our universities, we've got a word ceiling. So if you're not literate, you can't get beyond a certain level. Now, I actually don't want to be a Vice-Chancellor. I would turn down the salary. But there are things that I know I just wouldn't want to do. I would not want to do graduation. I can remember people's first names when I get to know them. Second names are a challenge. Reading names off a piece of paper, I couldn't do. I couldn't do the graduation. I love sitting in graduation on the stage. I get quite emotional. I don't often weep, but inside I'm thinking, isn't this amazing? People graduating, it's fantastic. And I can't do speeches. I can do what I'm doing with you now, because this is a bit of a talk, but I couldn't do a written speech. So I'm not going to be a Prime Minister, I'm not going to be a Vice Chancellor. So maybe, for me, maybe I've constructed my own word ceiling, but not without the help of a whole society which is discriminating, in my view, against picture thinkers and supporting people who are literate. So I do accept that this might all be in my mind, but I'm just suspicious that we've built a system of education and reward which doesn't actually support dyslexic people. And the problem we have is that there are words everywhere. I mean, why do I work in a university where actually it's just full of words? And I do remember one of my first bank managers saying to me after many years, saying, Nigel, I really appreciate you sending me monthly financial information. His name was Brian. Would you please stop calling me Dear Brain? Yeah, I mean, I'd only done it for 3 years. So all the time we've got these little traps that pick up the dyslexic. But I wonder whether also there's something going on in our dyslexic brain. So remember, I'm not talking about disability, I'm talking about difference. What we do know now is that the dyslexic brain processes information in a slightly different way. And I'm not going to bore you with the science, but I've tried to read about it. But what seems to happen is the dyslexic brain slows things down slightly. Now that can be a disadvantage when you're trying to translate somebody's word they're saying onto a piece of paper and writing it. That could be quite challenging if you slow down so much you can't do it. But you need that fine detail, quick thinking to actually hear a word and write it down. But actually, when you're dealing with massive amounts of information, really complex situations, then actually slowing things down a few milliseconds might mean that your peripheral vision, your ability to hold a concept in your head is actually greater than someone who has got that ability to do that other way of thinking. So we do see the challenge all the time of words everywhere. What I would say though is that it's clear from the dyslexic brain that what we do see is we see patterns where other people struggle to see those patterns. People who are not dyslexic could be characterised not so much as picture thinkers, not so much big picture thinkers, but more in terms of fine detail thinkers. So fine detail thinking is really something that's very important when you're processing language, and less important when you're dealing with really complex situations. So I'm not saying there should be jobs that only dyslexic people can apply for, but just imagine if we started to see organisations saying dyslexic wanted, apply here, yeah? And but what we actually do is the complete opposite. So if you're running a top organisation, you will recruit talent from top universities. They will be top graduates. To get into that top university, they've got to have top A-levels. And therefore, what we've done is in our organisations, we've discriminated in favour of fine detail thinkers who can demonstrate their prowess in the system that we've developed. So no wonder our large organisations are led predominantly not by dyslexic people. And yet we know that at least 1 in 10 of the population is dyslexic, probably 1 in 10 of this university, maybe even more because dyslexic people have got the cognitive ability to go to university, it might be 2 in 10. We know that with entrepreneurs it might well be 3 or 4 in 10. Of successful entrepreneurs are dyslexic. And yet we've designed a system which excludes them. We've developed an educational system that's all about fine detail thinking. And if you're good at fine detail thinking, you'll progress well. If you're a big picture thinker, you're going to struggle because we haven't designed the system in that way. Now, I'm not the only one who's saying this, thankfully, because I'm not an expert in dyslexia. Okay, I'm the dyslexic professor. It's not my area of expertise because as I said earlier, I'm a survivor. So there are other people who are talking about unconventional thinking, about picture thinking, about the power of being different. Some really interesting people writing about how having dyslexia can increase your level of grit and resilience And if you look at really successful people, they could be characterized as people with grit and resilience. What we notice with dyslexia is that it can become a power, because what you do is you actually learn to deal with trauma at school. Most dyslexic I know, when I meet adult dyslexics, it's really very obvious very quickly when we start talking to each other, we have a shared experience of trauma at school. And maybe that's the first time they disclosed to anyone else that they were traumatized at school. We develop workarounds. We've got some very sophisticated workarounds. We had a nice cup of coffee before the lecture, sharing our workarounds. It's great meeting dyslexics if you're a dyslexic, because you learn all about the workarounds that you develop to deal with a world that's not friendly for you. And I think also we're now beginning to see that maybe dyslexia is a difference, is an advantage, is a superpower, and maybe even a gift. And what we also see as dyslexics can flourish in later life, he says, in later life. Link that ability to determination and empathy and drive, and you start seeing some really interesting things. I'm going to suggest that our species has survived because we have at least 1 in 10 of our population who's dyslexic. So why do I say that? So it's not me just said this. Helen Taylor at Cambridge is talking about this quite a bit at the moment, this idea that actually in a population it's really powerful to have people who are not fine detail thinkers, who are picture thinkers, because they are beginning to do this opportunity recognition. They're looking for new things. The rest of the population is looking at exploiting those things, but what they're doing is doing that. And when you think about our species, we will have always had people with dyslexia right the way through. We've not been able to select out dyslexics yet, thankfully. But what it's probably meant is that our species survived because we have been able to hold neural diversity as a species that other species don't have. So we have some people that are really good at exploiting fine detail thinkers, and you need that, but we've also got other people who are really good at creativity, innovation, and that holding that diversity in our population, I think, is really important. However, we are in danger because we are selecting out in our most powerful institutions people with dyslexia. We've developed an educational system which actually selects out picture thinkers and rewards fine detail thinkers. So I think this is a time for us just to rethink about that. And maybe we need to think about how we need to develop an educational system not only support fine detail thinking, but also supports that big picture thinking as well. So just really coming to the end of this little bit before we go to questions, I just wanted to share something with you. Somebody once said to me, Nigel, what would you say to your 8-year-old self if you could go back and speak to that 8-year-old who is about to go to boarding school and experience the trauma? My immediate response to that question was say, I would say to that person, don't worry, I survived. Yeah? And they say, but Nigel, why have you said that? Because you're successful entrepreneur, successful academic, you've run community organisations, you've run your professional association, you've led in all sorts of environments. Surely you've done more than survive. And I think that just made me think, oh my goodness, no, it's more than survival. What I would need to say to my younger self is actually survival isn't enough. What I would want to do is to give them a sense of hope, that actually what they were about to experience, and I couldn't stop them having an awful 10 years at school, because they're just going to have an awful 10 years at school, because we've designed it to be like that. I would say there is hope. What I would say is that you have been born with a great advantage. Nurture that advantage, and it will serve you well throughout your life, and it will enrich the lives of others. So what I would say to an 8-year-old going into school, even if they know they've got dyslexia, I think you'd need to warn them it's going to be a tough journey. But hold on to the fact that when you leave school and you emerge and you've survived, that superpower will enable you to achieve great things, not only for yourself, but for other people. So hold on to that. So, I'm just going to open it out to questions, but I thought I would share with you 2 unexpected outcomes of disclosing I'm dyslexic. So, one of them is the use of the word superpower. When I started this, I didn't call myself a superpower. It took me a year to get to that point. And the reason I use the word superpower is that it's a joke if I'm with another dyslexic. Because if you're dyslexic, you've been told you're stupid, thick or lazy all your school life. So if I said you've got a superpower, you're going to say, oh, Nigel, I haven't got a superpower. And I'll say, I know, it's only a joke. But actually, maybe there's something quite serious here. Maybe you have got an advantage. When I start talking to adult dyslexic, they share with me their abilities. And I say, oh, do you think that's something to do with the fact you're dyslexic? Oh, I'd never thought of that. Oh, maybe I have got a superpower. So superpower is not designed to exclude people without dyslexia, but merely to say those with dyslexia, come on, I think we can do better than dysfunction, disability, and even better than difference. And I did say that actually what's been really useful is meeting other dyslexic. I get emails, not all the time, but regularly, from adult dyslexic. I've read your blog, I saw your post on LinkedIn, can we meet for a coffee, can we have a telephone call? It's a really powerful thing for me. I get to meet amazing people who have been successful and are dyslexic, and I learn their tricks, their coping strategies. And so what I would really like to do one day is work in an organisation that celebrates dyslexia, not by providing support, but by celebrating the fact we've got a neurally diverse group of people, and of which dyslexia is one of those things that can bring about organisational change. So I'm going to pause there and really open this out to questions.
Okay, thank you.